Hey everybody, it is Evan at getmethod.com, and it is my mission to make architectural designers worth more, and I teach digital design skills here on Method. And what I wanted to do today was pick up where I left off with a webinar that I was doing a couple of weeks ago with NoVeg. And Kevin over there, he was moderating that, and of course at the end we kind of ran out of time. I built this model during that webinar of this kind of classroom cluster, and I didn't get to do everything that I wanted to do. And there were some additional questions that were posed during the webinar that he kind of collected and then sent to me. So what I wanted to do was just answer some of these questions, and the best way that I could think of to do that was with another video, because some of these things I have to show you. It's easier to show than to just type it all up. So I'm just going to go through some of these and kind of just fly through this as fast as I can. And some of the questions don't require any modeling, so I might just talk a little bit, but just wanted to get those things answered so that people know why this is kind of my favorite modeling program to use for architectural modeling. So if you get a chance, go back and watch that webinar. It shows you kind of how I built this model from scratch in about half an hour. And then I'm going to pick up from the end of that. So the first question was, what are the shortcuts you're using for moving eye point around? Pan, zoom, and orbit. And by the way, some of these questions I did get to answer during the webinar, but I will go through them again real quick. So I like to use a 3D Connection space mouse. So I'm not using my mouse. You can see I'm moving my pointer, my cursor around here independently of the view that I'm manipulating. Now in FormZ, it has standard navigation tools, which, if I hold down the middle mouse button, I have orbit. And if I use the scroll wheel, I can zoom in and out. But there are some limitations to this in FormZ. It's a little different of a camera setup than we have in something like SketchUp, per se. And if I go into the Edit Cone of Vision here real quick, this is a tool that allows you to place cameras inside of FormZ. So you can see that we actually have a physical object here that's a camera. And I can click on the eye point, and I can move that around, and I can see what happens over here in my perspective view. I can click on my point of interest, I can move that around, and then I can change the actual field of view for that camera as well. And if I open up my view parameters over here, you can see we actually have all of the coordinates for each one of those things. So there's a little bit, there's a lot more fine-grained control of our camera inside FormZ. So for instance, if I wanted to look straight on at this building, let's say, I could set my Z point to 8 feet, and I could go over here and set my center of interest also to 8 feet. And you can see now I'm looking perfectly horizontal, and this is kind of a side view here, standing at 8 feet. So if I wanted head height, let's go maybe 6 feet for both of these. And now I have a 2-point perspective, basically, because I'm looking straight. You can see my verticals are straight, even though I'm in a 3-point perspective view type. All right, so I can do that numerically. I can set the focal length. So if I wanted a wider angle lens, I can go with a 55 millimeter. Oops, that's the other way around. I can go with a 25 millimeter lens. Or I can do these things graphically by just clicking and dragging on these. And then there's a couple other controls in here, which are hither and yon planes, and what those are is those can be clipping planes. So if I turn those on and I move my hither plane, you can see it starts to cut into the building so I can see into it. So now if I move the camera around, those clipping planes are always active. Same thing goes for the yon plane. I can clip so I can just see a slice through my model. I don't use that a whole lot, but I just wanted to explain what those are. Sometimes they're useful when you're modeling and you want to see what's going on in there. You can just turn on your clipping plane and do that. All right, so let's turn that back off. So now, like I said, you can do that numerically or graphically right here. But what I like to do, I use those to tweak my views. But like I said, I use a Space Explorer mouse. And one of the reasons I like a Space Explorer mouse is because I can zoom in and get really close to a face of an object. Whereas if I am in the cone of vision, to kind of illustrate what happens in FormZ, is when you're using your scroll wheel to zoom in and out, what happens is you're moving the eye point closer and closer and closer to the the center of interest. So you can see how that little arrow in the middle gets shorter and shorter and shorter. Well, what happens is you can only get so close to that arrow when you're using the scroll wheel. So to illustrate that, let's just do a fit here. Okay, so I'm not going to touch my space mouse. I'm just going to use the scroll wheel. And you can see here I'm zooming, 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 zooming. And at some point here, you can see my floor is getting closer, but I'm really scrolling on the wheel. And I can only zoom so quickly. And that's because, going back into Edit Cone of Vision, missed it there. You can see, again, I'm going to use the scroll wheel here. I can only get so close. I can't go beyond that. So in SketchUp, what's happening as a contrast to this is the whole camera is moving in SketchUp, but in FormZ, only the eye point moves when you're using the scroll wheel on the mouse. And that leads to a bit of frustration, I think. So I like to use the Space Navigator because I can fluidly get as close as I want or push away without ever having to move the scroll wheel on the mouse. So the navigation tools are right up here at the top. We've got Orbit. You can click on that. You've got Look Around, so it keeps your point stationary and allows you to look. We've got Pan, which is the standard back and forth. And the Space Mouse kind of takes over all of these. And of course, there's keyboard shortcuts, mouse shortcuts. So middle button push is Orbit. Shift plus middle button is Pan. All right, so that's the Pan. And I went over this in the webinar, but you can control, if you go into your key shortcuts and you go into Load Defaults, you can actually change the view navigation right here to work as, if I hit preset 1, this is Rhino defaults, preset 2 is SketchUp defaults, and then default is the way that FormZ comes out of the box. So you can just use those if you want, or you can set them up however you want. All right, so that's it for question number 1. All right, so what is your tool of choice for both quick and realistic animation rendering? Personally, I don't do any of that inside of FormZ. I don't render too many animations myself, but I know when I do, I would use Artlantis for that. And I go into a lot of these kinds of things on my website, which is at getmethod.com. And you can see some of the different tutorial videos that I've made there. I've made a few for Artlantis, teach you how to use it. And I don't get into animation in those tutorial videos, but if I were to do animation, which I've done a lot of in the past, I just don't have a need for it now because I tend to try to do things that are real-time walkthroughs, and I like to do those on the iPad. So I use software like Revisto or Game Engines or something like that to allow my clients to just walk right through it. Actually, I have a tutorial coming out pretty soon on how to do interior panoramic scenes using Maxwell Render. So I like to play around with that stuff, but I don't render a lot of animations. If I were, I would choose Artlantis Studio because of how fast it is, and the output is super nice. All right, next question. How do you use FormZ to show the client multiple design options? I did get to go over this in the webinar, but again, I would use a combination of layers and scenes. So let's see, if I had, I kind of drew something like this. If I had a glass box, which is like another room over here, and that's just floating off, and let's say I wanted to propose this glass box as a design option for kind of a sunroom or something. So first thing I would do is I would put that maybe on its own layer. Okay, so let's call this sunroom. And I'm just going to go ahead and click on that glass box, and with the attributes, I'm going to place that on layer sunroom. Okay, I guess I already did this during the webinar, so I have a glass box layer. So now I can control the visibility of that. And if I put any other objects on that same layer, if I click the little red button here, it's going to draw on that layer now. And let's say I've got another sunroom over here, and so there's a couple of, maybe with or without these sunrooms. All right, so now if I turn the visibility off, I have to make another layer active. If I turn those off, they go away. So now, and I have a tutorial coming out today on the website that talks about scenes. Let's see, I don't see it here, so it's hiding somewhere. Here it is. All right, scenes. What I could do is say design option 2 is going to have the scenes turned on, the sunrooms on. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this off. again, watch that video on scenes to learn how this works. And then let's make a new scene and call this sunrooms off. Okay, and I'm going to turn those off. And then I'm going to click this red button. All right, so if I was now showing this to a client, maybe I would do it with renderings, maybe not, maybe I would be doing it live. I can be anywhere kind of in my model, and if I hit this, it flips me back around to where I was, and it shows those sunrooms being turned on, and then I could click this button and it fades those out. Really nice animated. It looks good. So again, they're on and they're off. And it makes a nice little transition. I do tend to more and more do presentations right inside the software with the clients because it kind of gives them a little bit behind the scenes of how we work, which is a cool thing. But it also gives me the ability to make changes on the fly, so we can kind of roughly sketch in 3D right with them here. So design options is a great thing to use with the scenes combined with the layers palette. Okay, so I could just turn the layer on and off, but the scenes is kind of nice because it fades them in, fades them out. All right, so the next question is, I draw and render exterior scenes. Can you briefly compare rendering with Artlantis and Maxwell for FormZ? All right, so Maxwell, like I said during the webinar, is a plugin for FormZ when Artlantis is not. Artlantis is completely standalone, and I could file, export Artlantis 3 or 4. 4 also works for Artlantis 5. All right, so you can send this scene over to Artlantis by exporting an ATL file, opening that file in Artlantis. Now with Maxwell Render, the rendering program has a plugin, so I actually can control, I can use Maxwell Fire, for instance. So if I open that back up, I could see what this is looking like right here. Just click the box and start to see it, and I can zoom in, and it updates right here inside of FormZ, so I can get an idea of shadows and materials and all that stuff. And this is just what Fire is a fast interactive rendering environment. I think that's what it stands for. But it allows me to just manipulate my view and just have this going all the time, and I can check what this is going to look like. So what I would like to do at that point, once I kind of set my views, get my shadows where I want them, maybe I'll work in shaded mode here with the shadows turned on so I can see exactly what this is going to look like. Then I will click the Maxwell Render button. And by the way, in display options, I have controls over all of my Maxwell settings right here inside of FormZ. And again, I have lots of Maxwell tutorials on my website at getmethod.com. And you can see exactly how I use that. I have some tutorials for Bonsai 3D with Maxwell, which will work exactly the same inside of FormZ. So I can control all this stuff. And if I just hit render, or if I click this little button up here, it'll send it right to Maxwell. So the question was, can I compare them? Well, Maxwell is a completely non-biased photorealistic rendering application, and it by far gives amazing images at the expense of them taking quite a while. Whereas Artlantis gets you really nice looking renderings at a fraction of the time. So it really depends on what you're after. And I use both. That's the way I work. I work with lots of different tools. If I were doing animation, I'd go with Artlantis because I probably couldn't take the time expense inside of Maxwell. So that's a big comparison difference right there, even though people do render with Maxwell. The other cool thing you could do with either one of those programs is send your files to a rendering service and have them render for you. Both of them have, I know one of the new features for Artlantis 5 is a big cloud rendering service, and there are several for Maxwell Render as well. But when it comes to doing something super realistic and where you want control over just every little detail, I think Maxwell Render is pretty awesome. But I've used Artlantis quite a bit too, and I've never seen anything as intuitive to use as Artlantis. And so, sorry, there's no easy answer. I like them both. All right, the next question. I had a professor teaching this program to us when I was in architecture school. I remember him showing us a section tool within FormZ that I thought was really great. Can you show us that? Okay, so there is a section tool, and it is located over here under the Modify Tools, and there it is right there. And how the section tool works is it uses a plane in your scene to slice through your model. So I could draw a plane like that, and then I could say, show me a section through my walls. So I can click on my walls and select it, then I'll click on the section tool, and then I will click this plane. And what's that going to do? It's only going to cut through my walls. Okay, so whatever objects I have selected first before I hit the section tool, it allows me to slice through. Cool thing about the section tool now in FormZ version 7 and above is it is a dynamic section plane. You can see over here in my tool options, I can say make it a two-dimensional section. So now it's cutting through just giving me a slice. So if I hit cut section here, and let's delete the plane because I don't need that anymore, you can see I have just the planes left over from where it cut through my walls. All right, so that was one way to do it. The other thing I could do is I can say give me both sides and just slice. All right, so that just cuts right through. I can say 3D front, just gives me what's considered the front side of the section, or give me the back. So I can easily flip that over. And like I said, it's a dynamic section plane, so I can actually click on this arrow and dynamically slice through my building. I can stop wherever I want and then say cut the section. Okay. Now the section does not have to go all the way through the geometry. All right. So if I hit escape here, let's get out of that and say no, I don't want to cut that section. So for instance, if I pull this down and move this point over to here, you can see now that section plane no longer slices all the way through the model like it did the first time. And so all you really need is a sliver of a plane, any plane, to slice through a model. So let's see, I'm going to select my walls again, hit the section tool, and then hit that plane. And you can see it still slices through the entire object that I pre-selected. Okay, and again, of course, I can move that, I can rotate it. I can rotate it the other direction as well and go that way. So that's kind of a cool tool. You're right, it is a cool tool. So you can see how you can start to create additional interesting geometry with a tool like this. It's not merely for architectural sections, but it actually is a modeling tool. So there's that. Now, there is also clipping planes. Okay, so I'm going to click the little plus button over here in my clipping planes palette. And clipping planes are very similar, but they're temporary. They're really meant to be temporary. Okay, so clipping plane number 1 gets created, and you can see it looks just like a section. So I can slice through my model. I can rotate it, just like I could with sections. All right. Now the cool thing about clipping planes is you can actually animate them. So let's see here. Let's select it and hit the play button. You can see it just kind of oscillates through my model. That might be useful. I don't know how. I've never made it a useful thing for me, but it works. I can hit stop at any point. I can, again, just always be adjusting. And this is pretty cool for like cutting down into a model if you wanted to see what's considered maybe a floor plan view. You can also double click on, or so you can right click on these and you can flip them. So make it cut the other way. So now it's cutting the opposite direction. You can also do that right on the clipping plane itself. You can say flip. You can also make it 2D. So again, it's like just like the section tool. If I choose a 2D representation, it's just going to give me a plane, which is a surface of where I'm cutting through. The difference here is it's cutting through everything, right? So the section tool cuts through the objects I tell it to. Clipping plane ignores that. You don't have that option. You can only go and clip through everything with a clipping plane. All right, so that's another thing you can do. Also, you can make permanent, so that turns the clipping plane into a section tool, again, for everything in your scene that it's clipping through. So this bounding box kind of resizes. For instance here, if I zoom out and draw something over here, you can see that clipping plane resized. It encompasses everything in the scene. All right, so if I turn that clipping plane off, I don't get it. If I turn it on, it slices through everything. Again, you can rotate. If you wanted a vertical section and slice through your objects, you can do that as well. All right, so clipping planes are very cool. You can also turn them on, but turn off the representation of it, so that if you wanted to have a view of your model that was a section, but you didn't want to see that plane, so that you could export that view, you could do that as well. All right. So that is sections and clipping planes. And one of the other cool things about clipping planes is if you go into an object property, let me just make this in a new project real quick so it's not as complicated. But if I draw a cube, okay, and I add a clipping plane, it's going to slice through that cube. One of the cool things you can do with that is I can click on the object itself. I can go to its cross-section attributes right here, and I can say project clipping plane color. So if I click on that, it goes to yellow. And that is controlled under File, Project Settings, and Appearance. Clipping plane is set to, whatever color I want it to be. Okay, so I can adjust that color there. Or I can say custom color, and I can make it whatever color I want. So whenever it's slicing through an object, I see that color. And that's pretty cool for a building where you want to highlight the section. And you can't do that with the section tool. You can only do that with clipping planes. So I think that's pretty neat as well. So I tend to use clipping planes a lot more than sections. But I do use sections as a modeling tool. All right. So next question. Do you think this is a time saver method for design? I could do the same thing with SketchUp, ArchiCAD, Revit, or Vectorworks. What's the big value in doing this with FormZ as a firm designer? So yeah, you can do a lot of this stuff in any program. The reason that I prefer FormZ, number one, is because it's kind of BIM light. So it's way more BIM-y than SketchUp as far as having parametric values. So if I draw walls, if I go to my wall tool here and I say 6-inch wall and draw that, right? This is a parametric object still. So in SketchUp, I don't have that ability. But I can go into parameters and say change the wall width to 1 foot. And now I have a 1 foot thick wall. Or let's say my floor here. If I click on my floor that I drew, I can change the height to 1 foot thick. Or I could go -1 foot. So you can see I have all these parameters that I can modify later on in the design process to make updates fast. Now that also, doesn't work for everything. So for instance, if I went in to this floor, and let's say I use the push-pull tool to modify my floor, instead of, if I select that floor and turn on the controls for it, instead of doing it this way, so I can modify the shape of the floor by doing that. Instead, if I push-pull that and then click on there, I can no longer show controls. That breaks the parametric ability of that floor, which makes sense, right? You can't just freely modify stuff and then still expect the parameters to work. So if I drew a wall, it's parametric right now. You can see it's even highlighted in orange, which tells me it's parametric, which means I can make changes. 2 feet thick. I can click on that, show controls. Okay, modify the height, modify the start and stop points. I can also modify the width still. I can even change the justification and flip it over. But as soon as I, you can see I can even do those things graphically. But as soon as I push-pull, now I can no longer do any of those things. And this kind of answers a question that's coming up later. So there is a point at which you can break your parametrics, and then it isn't as smart as Revit or ArchiCAD anymore. But I have a lot more freedom to do tons of more things here, right? So, there's give and take for all this stuff, but the reason I like it is because I like to keep things as parametric for as long as I can. And I just feel like I have so much freedom in the modeling environment to be able to move around quickly. I mean, this is a huge benefit over a full-on BIM tool. I can export 2D drawings out of here. If I wanted to, I could go to my top view, And I could go, let's see, let's unisolate everything. And say I wanted to export this floor plan out, so I could go to a hidden line view, which is a nice floor plan, and I can export that out as a DWG file and send that to AutoCAD or DraftSite or some other program. Very easily. It's very easy because it thinks kind of architecturally. One of the other cool things, maybe over SketchUp, that I prefer about this is I can draw like a surface like this, and I can draw a switchback stair and click in there. And glass might not be the right option, but because this is a parametric stair, you can see I can go in, I can say add a landing. And one of the neat things about that is that this is parametric, right? So I can draw my stair just by clicking on a rectangle, and that doesn't look right, right? So what can I do? Well, I can modify all of the attributes and parameters. I can say railings, limits. You can see I can do all kinds of neat things with these here. So maybe I want to draw a longer rectangle to make my stair a little bit more realistic. And I can go into railings and say, yeah, no railings, no thanks. I can go in and say, let's make that just treads. And so, very cool, right? Because now I can go back into this one and do the same thing. Say, oh, just treads, because it's parametric. So there's a lot of neat things like that inside of FormZ that make me like to use it because it thinks architecturally. So it allows me to iterate really quickly, modify parameters, send stuff out, pull stuff in from any other modeling package. This uses what's called the Axis kernel for 3D modeling, which Revit reads really well. You can also import files from Revit when you save them out as DWGs if you use the Axis kernel, and they come in here as perfect solids. So I'm not dealing with surfaces like I am in SketchUp, which tend to be geometrically problematic. This builds perfect geometry as long as you kind of know what you're doing. And even if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to get much better geometry out of FormZ. So I like to work very accurately, and that's one of the reasons I like FormZ as well. All right, one of the next questions that I also covered during the webinar was, I do not understand how you made the glass wall halfway under the wall. How can you retrace your steps? All right, so let's see. I made a quick little, I'm going to change my reference plane here and just draw a frame of a window. Let me change my material away from glass. Let's go to aluminum. So if I just draw a frame, let's say this is a frame for a door. And the question was, how did I draw the glass halfway in there? Okay, well, number one, you don't have to do that, but I like to save as many steps as I can. So the first thing you do is you'll notice my reference plane down here is locked. If I unlock that and I go to draw anything, I get this reference plane that just kind of shows up everywhere. And this is a two-dimensional infinite plane that allows me to draw wherever I want. Well, what I tend to do is I tend to leave that locked because I don't like it jumping around. And then using this next button here, I can place it onto a surface. And now it's locked to that surface. What that allows me to do is now go, and I'm going to draw a two-dimensional surface. I'm going to turn off this insert button because I don't want it to glue to that geometry. I want this to be a separate object. I'm going to choose glass. And using my Space Explorer, I'm going to zoom in and snap to the midpoint. So because I have object snaps turned on down here, and right here is my interval snap turned on, midpoint is one of the intervals. So I can click there and you can see I start to draw this plane. And it's because of where I place my reference plane, I can now just click on this point right here, or maybe the midpoint right there, and you can see that it's drawn perfectly in plane. It's in the right spot. So again, one of the reasons I like FormZ is I can click on that plane, say Show Controls, and I can easily adjust the stretchiness of where that glass is placed. So if I wanted it to go to halfway, I could do that, or I can pull it all the way back up. And I can say Hide Controls. So you don't have to draw everything right exactly the first time, which is kind of like Revit. You can just draw stuff and then manipulate the heck out of it later. Similar here. So that's how I draw stuff. You know, I could have just built that plane. Let me delete that. I could have just built that plane here on the outside. And then I could move that plane. And if I zoom in here, I can move that plane over like that. right to the midpoint. Okay? So that's how you do it. Let's see, next question here. What is the advantage of using components versus groups? Similar to SketchUp, components versus groups, the only difference is components. So if I make this a component right here, right click, sorry, not right click, go to my components tab and say create component. This goes into a library. So I'm just going to say in this project only because I don't want this everywhere. Now if I move and say make a bunch of copies of this component. So let's make 4 copies of that component. So I have 5 total. If I go into any one of those and say edit component, right? And I go, let's adjust the frame size, thinner. Let's select the glass and show controls. And edit the glass so that it's all the way to the frame, and then turn controls back off, and component complete. Right click, component complete. All of the components get that update. That's the difference between components and groups. The other nice thing about components is because you're saving them to a library, when you say create component, you can save it to a library, and that library can be available to all of your projects. So you don't have to dig back through old projects and copy and paste. Okay. You'll notice that when you right click and say edit component, everything else goes grayed out except for the components. Okay, so working in groups is similar to that. So if I just make a quick little, let's see. I'll just draw something here real quick. So there's that, and I need to move my reference plane. It's all messed up here. Let's do that again. So let's say I've got a box and another box, and I want to make that a group. So select them all, right click and say group. Okay, now you'll notice that's all one object, so I can move all of those. Turn off my copies. I can move all those together now very easily anywhere that I want, just like a component. And when I right click and edit the group, everything grays out to isolate. It gives me a quick isolation mode, which is nice. So the main difference is, you edit one of these, they all update. That's the whole idea behind components. All right. The next one, since the walls are Boolean, do you have different materials on them? Okay, so this is kind of something I think that's coming from the past inside of FormZ. And so what I'm going to show you here is if I draw, let's say, well, one of the cool things about this now is that Booleans can be real time. So for instance, if I go here and I say insert, cut or fill, and I draw on this surface, I can just cut right through it right away. So that's one of the cool new things about FormZ 7. Is that Booleans happen right away. But what the question, I think, was regarding was if I go here and say draw with my wood material and do a cut. Let's see what happens here if this works. Nope, it didn't. It didn't leave that material. Sometimes what happened in the old version of FormZ was when you slice through, and I'm sure it still does this, if I maybe draw a separate object out here. And let's just pull that through there and then do an actual Boolean difference. So I'm going to keep the wall, click on that. Yeah, see how it painted those surfaces with a different material. So yeah, you can, and inside FormZ it's very flexible. You can paint a face of a wall with any material you want. So I can hold down the command key when I'm using the paint bucket tool to select just a face and click on it, and it applies that material just to the face. So you don't have to have separate objects for different materials. So this is just like SketchUp, right? Except that I have to hold down a modifier key to paint just a face if I wanted to. But you can see I can do that. All right, the next one is how would you orient, rotate, or adjust materials? A good question. Okay, so here's a great example right here with this wood. In our Attributes tab here, we have the Edit Texture material. So we use the Paint tool to apply the texture. But let's say I want this wood grain to be going horizontally instead of vertically. So I'm going to click Edit Texture, and then click on the face, and you'll see we get this little controller here. So I can, again, visually rotate that texture, or I can type that number in. So I can say 0, which is where it was, or I can type 90 into the Z and type that in and hit enter. And I can rotate stuff any degree you want. So if I click on this face, I get it again. Let's change the rotation and change the scale. You can see it's scaling it for the whole object because it's a solid material. So lots of texture control options right there. Again, if I wanted to paint a different material onto one side, hold down the command key, I think it's the control key on a PC, click on there, and then edit that texture. And you can see it's modifying that texture on that face. Pretty easy to do. Renders perfectly. It's open up Maxwell here, fire again. You can see it renders to the two different materials on the different faces. Okay, so that stuff is read to any program that you got to because it's establishing UV coordinates on the object. Okay, what are the pros and cons of making adjustments to lots of things at once? Well, I'm not exactly sure what that means, but I guess let me read the rest of the question. Maybe with groups unlocked or by setting topology to points and moving a selection of points. Say if a room size changes, I'm wondering how it affects parametric walls, doors, rounded objects, cylinders. Okay, so this is kind of getting back to the thing I said earlier, where if you actually modify the points or faces of an object, they do lose their parametric abilities. So let's say I go to the top view here, and let's say I wanted to stretch all these rooms out. So I can go with my pick tool, I can set it to area pick, and I can set it to points. And I could I can just click and drag a window that selects all those points. And actually, when you do that, you should be in wireframe mode, because if you're not, it'll only select the points that are on top. So if I select those and then move them, that's how I can make my rooms bigger really quick and move all the furniture and everything at once. But like I said, when you do that, you lose your parametric abilities. So no longer will this floor or these walls or anything be have parametrics to them. So you can also select faces. So I could select a face and just click on that and then move that face, which is kind of the same thing as just using the reshape tool, push pull. Again, here's an example of live booleans. I could just blow that wall out if I wanted to. Let's see, what else do we have? We can pick holes in objects, which is kind of neat. So for instance here, if I just go to the pick tool and I go to hole, you'll see it highlights a hole in the object. So I can quickly select a hole. Let's go to 3-point perspective here real quick. All right, so again, using the pick tool set to hole, I can highlight a hole in an object, click on it, I can move that hole over very quickly, very easily. All right, so again, that will make any object lose its parametric ability, but you still can manipulate the geometry as much as you want. No big deal. And then the last one was, what are the extensions at the bottom of the modeling tools in FormZ? So that's this palette right here. I mentioned this during the webinar. This is because I have Maxwell Render installed. So I can place MXS files. So let's say I had a bunch of 3D trees that were Maxwell scene files. I could use this and I can load in an object. So let's see. Entourage, I have some saved here. Let's say like I have some rocks that are pretty cool. So rock models, let's load a rock. And now what I can do is I can click and place that rock. Okay. And actually one of the cool things I like to do is this dynamic scaling. So I can place a rock and scale it. I can also do dynamic rotation. So when I place an object, and let's, instead of doing a bounding box, let's do points so we have a better idea. Let's try this again. So there's my rock shown by points. So this is the Maxwell scene file extension. Comes with, when you install Maxwell Render, there's also C for a parametric C surface. There's volumetrics like atmosphere and cloudy, kind of foggy kind of stuff. So the cool thing about that is when I render with Maxwell, You can see there's my rocks show up when I'm using Maxwell Render that I have, but they're not weighing down my scene with all that geometry. So this is great for trees and cars and rocks and things that are polygon heavy, but you only want to show up during render time. That's what this cool thing about these extensions are. All right, so I think that answers all the questions. If you have more questions, feel free to ask me right here on the website in the comments, or you can contact me at getmethod.com/contact. And again, my name's Evan. This is my follow-up video for the Noveg webinar. Be sure to check that out as well so you can see how I built this thing in the first place. And I look forward to hearing from you. If you learned something today, please donate to my website by clicking the donate button at the bottom of this post on the site. I would really appreciate it. It's what allows me to make more and more tutorial videos for the site. And I would love to hear what you think about FormZ. So go ahead and leave that in the comments as well. I'll see you on the next blog post here on Method. Bye-bye.